Welcome to Artificiality, where minds meet machines. We founded Artificiality to help people make sense of artificial intelligence. Every week, we publish essays, podcasts, and research to help you be smarter about AI. Please check out all of Artificiality at www.artificiality.world. We're excited to welcome to the podcast Shannon Vallor, Professor of Ethics and Technology at the University of Edinburgh, and the author of The AI Mirror. In her book, Shannon invites us to rethink AI, not as a futuristic force propelling us forward, but as a reflection of our past, capturing both our human triumphs and flaws in ways that shape our present reality. In The AI Mirror, Shannon uses the powerful metaphor of a mirror to illustrate the nature of AI. She argues that AI doesn't represent a new intelligence. Rather, it reflects human cognition in all its complexity, limitations, and distortions. Like a mirror, AI is backward-looking, constrained by the data we've already provided it. It amplifies our biases and misunderstandings, giving us back a shallow, albeit impressive, reflection of our intelligence. We think this is one of the best books on AI for a general audience that has been published this year. Shannon's mirror metaphor does more than just critique AI, it reassures. By casting AI as a reflection rather than an independent force, she validates a crucial distinction. AI may be an impressive tool, but it's still just that, a mirror of our past. Humanity, Shannon suggests, remains something separate, capable of innovation and growth beyond the confines of what these systems can reflect. This insight offers a refreshing confidence amidst the usual AI anxieties. The real power and responsibility remains with us. Let's dive into our conversation with Shannon Vallor. Shannon, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We're really excited to have a conversation today.
Really excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start with a question. What inspired you to write this book?
So I started this book in 2019, and so it took me 5 years to write, which is quite a long time. But the book was inspired by a lot of the work I was doing at the time to explain to people what AI and machine learning were. And this, of course, being in 2019, was well before large language models and ChatGPT took off as commercial products, but there was already a clear trend in AI development towards AI systems that were trained on large quantities of human-generated data, including social media data derived from our speech patterns, our behaviors and decisions, our bodies. And so I had been thinking for a long time about the best kind of metaphor to use to explain what AI is. And by choosing the right metaphor and avoiding other metaphors, also avoid misleading people or helping people not to be misled about what AI today isn't. Because, like lots of people, I grew up on visions of artificial intelligence that were informed by science fiction, in which AI is almost always presented as another kind of mind, a sentient, conscious machine that can understand you and relate to you in much the way a person would. And I was already seeing people trying to fit their understanding of the AI tools that were being marketed as somehow fitting into that box. And having worked with AI researchers and machine learning developers for quite a few years, actually, I knew very well that these tools are being developed in a way that does not move towards the direction of conscious or sentient machine intelligence, but that moves towards something that functions in a very different way, like a mirror, producing statistical composites of the patterns found in our behavior, in our speech, in our decision-making, and then giving those back to us in forms that appear intelligent. And so I wrote the book to begin to unpack this metaphor more fully so that we could avoid the confusion about what AI is and where it's going. Well, of course, once ChatGPT and other tools built on large language models started hitting the market a few years later, it became clear that the mission of the book was much more urgent, because immediately that illusion of consciousness and sentience through the capabilities of a large language model became very powerful. And so the book opens with a reference to the way that the Google engineer Blake Lemoine was captivated by his interactions with a model that he was testing at Google, which convinced him that he was interacting with a fully sentient machine person. And that was despite the fact that everyone who built these systems knew that that was materially impossible, and that he had fallen into some kind of illusory trap. And yet it was a trap that could trap an expert, right? Blake Lemoine is not a novice. He's not someone who just didn't understand what he was working with. So how could he fall? If he could fall victim to this kind of illusion, then any of us could. So I really wrote the book with that inspiration to kind of break through that illusion for people so that they could make more informed decisions about what AI tools are good for and what they're not, what their risks are, what their risks aren't. Because there's also a lot of misinformation building around the risks of these technologies, and people, being frightened by scenarios that are very unrealistic for the tools that we have today. So I wanted to pull back some of the hype, but also some of the AI doom narratives, and point things in a direction that's much more grounded in reality for people.
And I think you've been really successful at that, and it's one of the reasons that I mean, when people ask me this year, everyone asks, what's the best book to read on AI? I actually think for beginners, this is one of, people that are new to the field, this is probably the best book this year. And the reason for that is pretty specific, actually, is that the mirror metaphor was different than I was expecting when I first picked up your book. And part of that has been my journey through this. The mirror metaphor for me, what I was expecting was much more sort of a mirror of cognition, a story of how we're learning about human cognition through building it in AI, and we're taking inspiration from things we learn in human cognition and applying it. So I was sort of thinking about it in that back and forth way. But as I started to read the book, I thought, oh, no, this is a different version of the metaphor. This is one that is actually, in many respects, way more powerful, because it's the sense of shallowness and of reflection and of a static, not a dynamic trap, if you like. So I found that super helpful. What have you found as you've talked to people and they've read the book? How much is that pushing the metaphor in different directions? What are other people taking from it? How does that, where have you come to with your thinking on how that's changed the landscape here?
Yeah, that's been a really interesting journey, because I started writing the book, as I mentioned, 5 years ago, but at the same time, I was already giving talks on this metaphor. So I was giving talks about AI as a mirror. And my initial understanding of the application of the metaphor was pretty simple. But after every talk, people would come up from the audience and say, this metaphor is just so helpful for me. And in fact, while you were speaking, it occurred to me that AI and machine learning tools are like a mirror in this other way. And they would tell me this other way that the metaphor works. And I'd grab up my phone and open my notes pad and be typing things in going, oh, yes, it's also a metaphor in this way. So as the book develops, you'll see it incorporates the many ways in which the metaphor can actually help us understand. It's not just this kind of initial, it reflects the patterns of our intelligence. The dimensions of distortion that we find in mirrors, the ways that mirrors also occlude things from our vision, that they can be used to magnify, right? All these ways that mirrors work are likewise ways that AI mirrors work. And what was funny is in the most recent version of the book talk that I gave at a conference in Norway, Again, people came up in the audience afterwards telling me what it made them think of. And a physicist came up and she said, I sat there listening to your talk and initially thinking, oh, this is a metaphor. And of course, all metaphors break down eventually. No metaphor really describes the true scientific reality of what it's being used to capture, because it's borrowed, and whole idea of a metaphor is it's borrowed from another domain of reality. But she said, you know what? I don't even know that it's a metaphor. She said, the more I think about it as a physicist who understands how mirrors work, I actually think that these are just a new category of mirror, and that the physical properties of mirrors are really carried over into these machine learning models in ways that, as I listened to you talk, I began to believe were more and more literal. So it was really interesting because she was the first person to say, I'm not even sure this is exactly a metaphor, because every way that I think about mirrors as a physicist applies to this particular kind of technology. I think it also really has gratified me to see how many people from disciplines outside of philosophy and computing, and also people who aren't academics at all, who come from business or policy or the arts, or people who are just interacting with AI in an everyday commercial context without understanding what it is. How many people have come to me and said, this really helped me understand. Because one other inspiration for this book was, as you sort of signaled, to make it as readable as possible and as interesting and engaging as possible for as wide an audience as possible. So my first book was not intended to have a wide and diverse readership. It was written so I could get tenure. And so I had to follow the, traditional scholarly habits in order for it to be evaluated in such a way by the profession of academic philosophy, such that I would be able to get promoted on the basis of that book. So when you write your first book and your promotion hinges on it, you really have to tailor it for a very narrow audience of senior scholars in your discipline who will be looking at it through that lens. But what was fantastic about writing this book is I was already full professor. I didn't need this book to do anything for me personally in my career. I had the freedom to write it however I wanted, for whoever I wanted. And so it was really amazing to be able to write a book that I could not just bring in metaphors, but I could mix different disciplinary perspectives from computing, from the arts, not just philosophy, and that I could also bring in science fiction and literature and poetry and all the other things that I think can shed light on both the human condition and the reality of these technologies. So it was more fun to write than anything I've ever written before, because I was able to kind of play with the form of a book and also think about what would I want to read.
Yeah, well, I found it fun to read in that respect, and had my own sort of literal, that's experience of it, this being more than a metaphor, when literally just sort of standing in front of the mirror and just forcing myself to look at myself and not do anything for a while. And finding that it felt a little bit like spending too much time on one question with ChatGPT.
Yeah.
You just sort of, you get stuck somewhere. And you don't really know where you get stuck. You just know it's not where you want to be. There's almost this narrowing of the world. So I found that kind of a literal experience.
I think you've really captured something you mentioned a moment ago about the shallowness of reflections. So they're very impressive right up front, but there's not much more to discover within them. And I find similar things in having conversations with large language models. When you first start talking to a large language model about something, it can be very impressive and very compelling at first. But if you try to push the conversation deeper, it eventually starts repeating itself and losing the thread, right? And not being able to follow you any deeper. And I think that is very much an indication that what we're, again, dealing with is not thoughts, but reflections of thoughts that, just like mirror images, don't have that kind of infinite depth behind them that our minds do.
And you have to, I found the sensation of it was kind of palpable, that you could say you're stuck in a local minima or whatever, but what it felt like was why can't I have to actually completely shift space and shift frames to take another tack at this, to have another view of this. I need a different mirror. So I found it really interesting as a way of thinking about what you would want an AI to be able to do, which is to recognize you're there and change it for you or help you change it. And that doesn't seem to be, that's not an experience I've had with a large language model yet.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you spoke about the fact that when you look in a mirror, you turn your head right and the face in the mirror turns its head right too, right? And it doesn't have its own independent direction. It's your mirror reflection is tied to what you're doing. And if you think about the way that when you talk with ChatGPT, right, one of the most frustrating things that people have encountered is that if you tell ChatGPT or another large language model, I mean, they all essentially do this, that they've got something wrong, they'll immediately apologize and say, oh, yes, you're right, I got that wrong. Even if, by the way, they didn't get it wrong. So you can gaslight these things into, apologizing for things they haven't got wrong. But let's say it did get it wrong. It will sort of apologize for it. But then you can lead it back to the same error over and over again, and it will just follow you, right? Mm. And you don't get this resistance, right? You'll never get this large language model saying, actually, you're full of it. You don't know what you're talking about. And you'll never hear it tell you that you've contradicted yourself, right? And that it's going to lead you back to. So this resistance and friction that we have when we're encountering another mind that sees things differently than we do is almost entirely missing. And instead, it turns itself in whatever direction we're turning with our language and speech. It responds to our cues much more like a mirror image does to the turns and twists of our body than it does to another speaker who is, kind of synchronizing itself with us. Another mind will synchronize itself with us, but always with a distance and always with friction and always with its own, direction and meaning. And that just, the more you interact with large language models, you realize that is completely missing.
Yeah, and there's also there's a challenge there that the reflection that it sort of represents, it creates a reflection and representation, but often it doesn't really understand, meaning, and I'm not talking about whether it understands or not, but I can say something that's completely confusing and it just comes back with some sort of answer and goes down a path without stopping, as you say, with the friction. If I'm saying something to you, like I may be right now, that's not very clear, you'll say, wait a second, I don't really understand what you're talking about. Can you clarify that? Because I'm not sure how to respond quite yet.
Yeah.
But it doesn't pause for that. It just bang and replicates something for you.
That's right. No, you're absolutely right that one of the cues that these systems actually don't have understanding is that they never stop and say, I don't understand, right? Because they're pattern recognition and replication machines that work on statistical guessing. And so it will never stop and say, oh, something's missing here, I don't understand this. It will press on with the pattern generation and generate the closest pattern it thinks follows what you've said. And that's actually not thinking. What's really interesting about these tools, and something I say in the book, is they don't think at all, which in some respects can be a good thing, right? There are occasions when it's nice to be able to get an answer without having to do the process of thinking about the topic. But the problem is we don't recognize that distinction. We don't ask the question, what sorts of things actually do require us to think about them? And it's not a good thing if we just throw the thinking out of the process and just go straight from question to answer. There are some scenarios where that can be useful in very limited ways. But for the most part, these systems are being used in contexts where the thinking actually matters. The understanding, the working your way along to the answer matters. It's not just about where you end up. And these systems, whether they get the answer right or whether they get the answer wrong, are doing the same thing. So when these models confabulate, even when they give you a completely ridiculous and obviously false answer, they're actually not malfunctioning in that scenario. We treat it as if it's a malfunction, but actually the system's doing exactly what it's doing when it gets it right. In neither case is it understanding, right? Whether it fails or succeeds in giving you the correct answer, it's not thinking or understanding in either scenario. It's doing a kind of statistical pattern prediction that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So that, and the mistakes that they make do not reflect at all the sorts of mistakes that understanding learners make, where once you understand the sort of basic foundations of something, the errors you make will almost always be more sophisticated or subtle in nature than the ones you would have made when you didn't know anything. But these systems can give very complex, impressive answers, and then the next minute answer in a way that suggests that they have never learned anything about the topic, right? So there's no kind of continuity or growth of our understanding in the model. They'll go from, an answer that someone in the 98th percentile of experts would give to something that, someone in the 3rd percentile of knowledge of the subject matter would give. And that indicates that what's happening here is nothing like learning, nothing like understanding, where there's a kind of progressive consolidation and stabilization of knowledge of the subject.
And an internal critique. That's one of the things that I grasped in the book that I initially sort of reacted. There's a lot of reasons why. Initially reacted a little bit negatively to, mainly because we talk about machines as a mind for our mind, and there's a whole story there that Dave can relate. But, you're really clear. These aren't minds.
Nope.
Right? These are not minds. At the moment, they're not minds. And our mind for a mind idea is a metaphor, and there's a story behind that. But it's more aspirational. It's beyond what they do now. It's taking it further out. It's like what we really want these things to be able to do for us in a better world. But I was struck by your particular perspective around learning and consolidation and building to as a process of becoming a better human.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of conversation at varying levels, and depending on whether you're talking to a computer scientist or a coder or an educator or someone who's just trying to get better at their job or someone who's just trying to think better and using these tools. There's a sort of a hierarchy of how much you are trying to improve yourself and your ability to sort of metacognitively step back and say, I'm in a hole now, I shouldn't be using this thing, or I need to go and struggle more, or this is a very human thing. Maybe there's no answer to it, but the process of struggling and wrestling with it is actually the valuable piece. And it's quite a new skill to step back and be able to say, this is a good thing that I can use just to get the answer, versus I actually really need to struggle with this. I need to sit in this because it's growing me. And I feel like we're only at the start of the conversation about what it means to have that metacognition, to say, or that skill to say, I need to avoid this thing now. I have to go struggle with a person, or I have to struggle with my feelings. I have to pull something out of my subconscious and then deal with it myself rather than try and use any of these tools.
Yeah.
So I was sort of struck by that approach, your background bringing that particular sort of moral reasoning aspect to this.
Yeah. So my background is in an approach to moral and intellectual development called virtue theory that really emphasizes the way that both morality and intellectual wisdom are developed through practice, right? Through habitual training of the moral and intellectual muscles of the mind, right? And the body. And the idea is that without that work, without that, as you say, that sort of struggle and striving in practice, we actually don't develop the capacity to solve problems that we've never encountered before, that no one has an answer for, right? And that's one of the most vital skills that humanity needs right now as the world changes very quickly. We need to develop the kinds of moral and intellectual muscles that can tackle problems that we've not actually got a rule book for, right? We've not actually got a statistical mountain of evidence pointing to the solution. And the problem is, what we've done then is build a bunch of tools that is incentivizing us in every domain of learning to get rid of that work. And that friction of clawing our way to the solution in favor of immediate transport to the solution. And when I struggle with my students, of course, as all educators are struggling right now, to get my students to recognize the value to them of doing that work rather than relying on the tool to get them to the answer first. And I use the analogy of a mountain climber, right? Students respect things like physical skill and talent in many cases. And so I find this to be a useful metaphor. And I say, look, how do you get to be a good mountain climber? Well, by climbing up difficult mountains, right? And by learning what to do when you start to slip, and learning what to do when, you realize you're kind of out beyond your capacity, and struggling and failing and continuing to work at the process. And you know that the mountain climber is not the one who takes the helicopter to the summit, right? The person who takes the helicopter to the summit can't mountain climb at all. Now, what happens when the helicopter's not there, right? And so I basically tell them, look, this area of expertise that you're trying to learn so that you can use this knowledge in your career is like developing the skill of mountain climbing. And you're going to encounter problems in your career that no one knows what those are right now, that no one can train you right now for the problems that you will encounter in 10 years in your field. So what you need is the skills of mountain climbing, and not the set of answers at the top of the summit that you can helicopter to right now with ChatGPT. Those will not help you. And that starts to break through a little bit to students, but they're so convinced that at this moment, if they don't use the tool that will get them the answer the quickest, and that will statistically get them the right answer more often than they can get there on their own, that they're going to be left behind. And so that for me, and seeing how that may affect the capabilities of the next generation if we don't do something about it, is really terrifying, and something that I think makes for me the book a kind of urgent call to action of, we have to reclaim the responsibility of making ourselves capable morally and intellectually of thinking, of understanding, of working, of deciding, of taking responsibility, and of being able to take the risk of failing. Because we've got a lot of mountains to climb, metaphorically speaking, in the future, right? Big moral, intellectual, scientific, political mountains to climb. And we have to have the skills to do it.
I agree with you. I think that I have a moment of wondering how to inspire people to accept and embrace difficulty, and that's really what it is, right?
It is.
You can see that
and uncertainty as well.
Uncertainty. And when the measurement in front of them, which is get the task done quickly because I'm working for a profit-driven business that needs to just get it done, then they're sort of following that. I had an intriguing conversation with one of our children over the weekend who's in college, starting his junior year. And he said, yeah, I tried that thing out, but when I realized it couldn't do my homework for me, I just haven't even gone back to it. So at least for him, the measurement in front of him was also in this same idea. Like, it wasn't pushing to skip past the difficulty, to skip past the friction.
Yeah.
I do love your mountain climbing metaphor. And I also think about it a little bit as not just the challenge of knowing what to do when you slip, knowing what to do, how to save yourself, that sort of difficulty. But I think about climbers planning a route.
Yeah.
And there's sometimes you have to know the route, that's optimal, but often, and it may be more in a sort of a gym setting where there's lots of different variations, it's the right route for you. Mm-hmm. Based on your physical capabilities, your interest level, your flexibility, whatever it is, but your route up that might be slightly different from somebody else's, but you have to have gone through it to figure it out. And so I like the way that you're thinking about this, and I really like the sort of changing the mindset to say these tools are really extremely useful, but what are you using them for?
Yeah.
Is there something there that still allows you to have that learning moment, that really embeds it inside yourself rather than just delegating that, to a tool.
Yeah. And I think what you're highlighting is that the process of learning and thinking and the struggle that's involved in that is not just how we come to understand the world, it's also how we build self-knowledge. And without that process, it becomes impossible to understand really who you are in a way that isn't just a sort of generic approximation of a human, which is what LLMs give you, right? A generic approximation of a human knower. But we aren't that. We are individuals with different cognitive strengths, different moral strengths, different perceptual capabilities, different physical capabilities, different interests, different values. And knowing yourself and knowing those strengths and knowing how you want that to change is really, really important, right? So knowing yourself and then saying, okay, what aspects of myself do I want to build up? Or what aspects of myself do I want to preserve and treasure? What aspects of myself do I want to maybe let go? This is part of learning, to be okay with yourself because you're a project that you are constantly engaged in your whole life, right? The choices that you're making, the values and ambitions that you're pursuing. And I think, again, so much of that comes from the experience of banging our heads against problems in the world that ChatGPT is now promising us we can get away from. And so in the second to the last chapter of the book, I talk a lot about the values in Silicon Valley that are reflected in these mirrors, right? The values of efficiency, of delivery, frictionless delivery, right? Get it there fast, cut out the work, cut out the effort, cut out the labor, especially the human labor, right? And again, that's the helicopter to the top of the mountain approach, which is incredibly short-sighted. I don't know how these tech companies think they're going to have the best talent in 20 years when they're training everyone to bypass the process of, developing deep comprehension of how to engineer things, how to solve incredibly complex problems, right? And so
how to persevere. And how to work with others. I think there was a moment as I was reading this and listening to your metaphor, your analogy about the mountain climb, that so much of everything that we've done is pushing people to be almost overly individualistic on, like far beyond the word individualistic, and the collective intelligence of, because part of climbing that mountain is doing it with a group.
Yes.
And recognizing that there's one person who's stronger, one person who's weaker, having a sense of, we live in the mountains. We do a lot of talking about this. Mm-hmm. The baseline rules, if someone's not comfortable, everyone goes down. Those kinds of collective decision-making processes, it does, we do see some erosion in this ability to coordinate problems. It's getting worse as we scale and connect everything. There's no, the negative repercussions of all of this is we'll head to a world where the only thing that can make a decision is the AI sitting across all of the data of us all connected together. Keeping our agency and our skills in collective decision-making and coordination and not falling prey to collective stupidity, that's where I thought, your book takes a different tack at that root. It's about that I didn't know a lot about virtue theory until I read your background and went back and looked at some of the YouTubes. But it sort of struck me just how vital that message is. As every single individual over-relying on these tools has a supremely collective moral outcome that isn't good. And we can't just blame the tech companies for that, because we actually have to take responsibility for claiming this back again as individuals.
That's right. And, the problems that the human family is facing are increasingly large-scale coordination problems, right? No one is going to, and this goes back also to virtue theory, which has been criticized sometimes for being overly focused on the individual's virtue and not enough on the coordination of collective virtue. And I think that's fair. Although, people like Aristotle, who, first developed a kind of foundations of a virtue theory, always saw decision-making as political and and coordinated. So he always saw individual virtue against the backdrop of this kind of political organization of common effort. But I think it's very easy to forget that and think about virtues as the thing that individual builds themselves and makes themselves independent. And actually, so much of what we have to do in the next century is about solving problems that no individual has the view of that would allow them to see the solution, but that together we need to kind of coordinate that. And so I'm actually quite interested in thinking about how technology could help there. And could we design technologies? Because I'm not against technology. I'm not against AI. I'm not even against, the prospect of machine minds. I'd love to see them. We don't have them. And these technologies that we're using today are not, I think, the path to them. But I think it could be a wonderful thing to be able to engage with artificial minds were we to have them. But what I'm really interested in is something much more realistic and near term, which is, I think, could we build technologies to help scaffold our own intellectual and moral and political development? The way that we use, and I'm going to go back to the mountain climbing because I love metaphors, right? Think about the technologies that help us get to the top of the mountain. Other than the occasional, free climber who's taking, insane risks, we don't get to the top without technology. We get to the top through pins that have been hammered into the mountain face, and ropes and hooks and all of the gear that we use together, right? Paths, gear that we leave there for other people to use, right? Gear that we share. And then we use that to scaffold our way up the mountain in these very challenging conditions. And I think about, can we reconceive what technology is for? Instead of thinking of technology to be a competitor for human labor or a replacement for human labor, can we think about technology that is a scaffold for human effort that allows us to move further and higher and to do that together? Because humans aren't really good at collective decision making. Like, that's just not naturally something we're great at. And there are a lot of pre-digital technologies used, technologies for governance, right? Democratic technologies that were used to try to boost and scaffold our skills at collective decision-making. But I do think there is a role for AI to play in that story. I just don't think we've written that story yet because we're so focused on, again, these values of efficiency and short-term profit extraction from these tools that we're just using them in the cheapest and most short-sighted way possible instead of using them to invest in human intelligence and growth.
Yeah, we're focused on this sort of efficiency story, and we're very focused on understanding and analyzing the tools as they are today, which, we often say are they're the worst, some of the worst designed software we've ever seen. Yeah. And I don't mean to be insulting, but ChatGPT wasn't designed really in that way. It was just an opening to a model. Yeah. No one stopped and thought about the workflow or what the human need or desire was. It was just exposed as an experiment, and for that purpose, I guess it worked. But I'd love to have you to go a little bit deeper on this question of your scaffolding idea. We're in a couple of months, we're holding a summit that is about imagining a hopeful future with AI. So we're thinking longer term, we're definitely thinking imagining, and we're thinking about what we hope for.
Yeah, I love
and going at that from what we hope for in terms of the human experience of AI, right? So we're not digging too deep into exactly what the technology is or what kind of models or what comes after transformers and all that other stuff, which is important, right? But we're thinking more about what we hope for the human experience. And I'd love to hear you expand a little bit more on this idea of what you hope for in terms of scaffolding. What would that be like? What would you hope to have an AI do to scaffold your students, whatever group you're thinking of?
That's a great question. And I think it's a hard one to answer because I think the answer is different for different domains of knowledge and expertise, right? And for different levels of knowers, right? The tools that we would build if we wanted to create the next generation of expert systems that could help experts actually be better at their jobs are different than the ways we might scaffold novices into a new area of understanding, right? But I do think that one big lesson that we have not learned is that the most important kind of knowledge that you need when you're designing an AI system is the knowledge of the domain expert practitioner, the person who lives where the AI is going to enter. And this is the exact opposite of what we've done, for example, in education, where, as you said, we didn't design ChatGPT for schools. We didn't, absolutely not. We took it and then we dropped it on the head of every educator across the globe and said, you've got to use this now. And by the way, your students are using it whether you want to or not, so you better adapt. And so we've basically forced an entire profession, and education is a profession, right? We're good at what we do for the most part. And we have very specific techniques that we've developed over centuries, in some cases, or millennia in some cases, to help people learn. And then we've now all had these giant tools dropped on our head that weren't designed for our profession and that are very poorly adapted to our needs and our students' needs. And so now we're kind of stumbling around in this mess, trying to figure out how to reconstruct something that's functional. What if you had essentially said, look, here's this suite of things we can do with machine learning and AI, and not just, large language models, but kind of much narrower targeted tools, as well as, symbolic AI and all these things that we have in our toolkit in AI and machine learning, which is a broad field, right? This is the other thing I spend a lot of time telling people is AI does not equal large language models, right? It's a broad and diverse suite of techniques and tools that fit a lot of different purposes and use cases. So what if we had brought that whole suite of tools into the realm of education and said, what are your biggest problems that you don't have the tools to solve? And is there anything in this suite of capabilities that we could apply to those challenges that you have? And the answer would have been yes. There's lots of things that as educators we could have benefited from AI to help us with. And there are a few things that still do, transfer over usefully. So for example, the ability of AI to help with kind of real-time translation challenges in under-resourced classrooms where you just can't have a human translator for every student in the classroom who's coming from a different language background, right? The ability to use AI tools to kind of narrow those gaps between, the students who are speaking a different language than they grew up with in the classroom. The opportunity to help level the playing field with tools like that is really huge. And educators would have seized on that immediately, but they would have seized on it in ways that have been much more aligned with their needs than what we've got now. So I think the lesson is, essentially what we call in the field of responsible AI and others, we call it, participatory design, or collaborative, design. The idea is start with the people who know the problems and help them shape where the technology goes, instead of building a technology and then dropping it on the heads of practitioners and domain experts and saying, well, do something with this. And yeah, we know it doesn't really work for you and it causes more problems than it solves, but here it is, it's the latest technology, so that's what you get. So thinking about how to design that scaffolding with the people who know what the problems are, where the gaps are, where you need to build a new kind of bridge with technology to get people where they need to go. That's what we're missing.
Yeah, and we've ended up just scrambling to find these, to almost to put data around things that everyone knew anyway, so that you can justify then going and doing the correct design. OpenAI, when they dropped this on the world, certainly set back the development of really good, well-designed use for these tools.
I think that's right.
And it's frustrating. And the kind of pushback right now is a function of that, and a function too of the resource extraction and the IP writing roughshod over people's creativity, the opening up of all these schisms in the legal profession about what's and the legality of what's legal and what's not. It's sort of just chaos when we didn't really need it, is how I feel about it right now.
Yeah,
well, and
exactly right.
You make a really good point about the fact that AI it does not equal LLMs. And, we started dealing with AI in 2012, started writing actively about it a couple of years after that. And we sort of adopted the idea that AI follows more of the academic principle as a very broad field.
Yep.
And lots of things over many decades have been, has fallen into that broad bucket. I think that's really important now, however, when we think about the future. You're saying, it's not just about LLMs, it's about a variety of other machine learning techniques. And once we combine those things, we can create something truly useful. And we just came across that in the last couple of days. We're doing some work with a client that's in the transportation space, and looking at some videos as a public product from Uber Freight. Mm-hmm. And they have this large language. They have a language interface to be able to go query your entire supply chain and ask interesting analytical questions about what's going on in that. And when you first look at it, if you just think of the world of LLMs, I would assume that one of your early concerns would be errors, right? Like, how do you know whether this thing can actually go accurately grab data and bring it back? Because if you've followed the space, you know all about hallucinations and everything else. Well, under the hood, it's actually using a variety of different ML techniques. It's using a language model to understand your query and then translate that into SQL, and then use a different agent, just to get technical, the multi-agent structure, to then go query a SQL database. Well, we know that those are pretty accurate.
Yeah.
And then it can bring back. So we're moving to a world which is going to break this model that the large language model with a prompt window as the only interface to this grand technology is the only thing we have, and whether the future of these models can somehow be able to be do absolutely everything everybody wants in one interface. That's breaking apart, and we're seeing much more interesting things. And I love how you said, talk to educators about what would be useful. How could it be useful to create a research tool to help a student find good sources of things? Yeah. That seems like a good, useful thing, right? I'm studying this. Where are some interesting ideas? What are some papers I've never come across? What are books that I haven't heard of?
What about just everything that my prof has ever read?
What am everything my prof's ever read? I think about I went to a university that had some, very big, large, old libraries of, old manuscripts that, it could help me find whether there was a manuscript there that I could actually go ask permission to look at. So I think that that's important. And I love this sort of scaffolding concept that, you're thinking that this is something that could be helpful to you rather than be the lead.
Yeah.
I would like to go back to one question, because I understand that the pushback and resistance and because I agree with your reflection that these tools are not minds today. Mm-hmm. I'm curious from your perspective, what might make it a mind, or what might you want? If what would you want for that to be a mind? I think you said something like that earlier, that could be a good thing. So what of having a technology become some form of a mind to you is potentially attractive, potentially something you might hope for?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that we know about minds, and sometimes people say, well, nobody knows what consciousness is. Nobody knows what a mind is. And so how do you know that it's not in an LLM? Actually, we know a ton of things about consciousness and about minds. We don't know everything, right? But it's not like neuroscientists and cognitive scientists have been sitting on their hands for 100 years, right? We actually have a lot of knowledge. And we know that we know two things. We know that in every creature that is consciousness seems to be grafted upon older biological structures that rely heavily on our embodiment, right? We have very good reason to think, for example, that there's some form of mind in an octopus, right? They're highly intelligent creatures, very creative problem solvers. There's lots of indications there. But we also have reason to think that because of its lifespan, because of its very different embodiment and neural structure, the fact that its brains are extended into its arms and operate somewhat independently, we have lots of reasons to think that whatever an octopus's mind is like, it's very different from the kind of human experience we have. But what we do know is that an octopus's mind is, like ours, very dependent upon its capacity to sense and move in the world. And so one area where I think we pursued for a while development of AI, but it was very slow and not immediately profitable and fairly costly research, is thinking about embodied AI and thinking about AI that learns through physical sensing and interaction with a continuous environment that allows it to build up a cognitive representation of the world that it's navigating and solving problems in. So this is the merger of AI with different kinds of robotics that can actually not just solve problems in the world, but begin to scaffold the development of cognition of the world. Now, I'm not sure that we know how to build sensors and processing networks in robots that can do what biological processing does in a human cognitive experience. So I'm sort of agnostic about whether consciousness depends on something biological that we do not have the capacity to replicate in other kinds of matter. Like, I really don't know the answer to that question. But the only way we will find out is by trying to do it and by scaffolding, like other minds do, scaffolding minds on top of bodies in motion. Mm-hmm. And bodies in motion that have to solve new problems in the world. And I think there's a lot of really interesting science fiction about how that would work, right? The other thing is, we think that minds also have a lot to do with a qualitative experience of the world that is valenced as positive or negative in certain ways. So emotion and feeling and the ability to suffer or feel pleasure, we think probably has a lot to do with how higher order consciousness develops. So it's not just about solving problems, it's also experiencing things as good or bad. So thinking about how that might be developed in systems. And then there's the kind of higher order cognitive level where you have to have a stable representation, a stable but adaptable representation of the world that you're in, that you can then have higher order reflections upon. And that's obviously something that we see large language models failing at all the time, to maintain a stable understanding of how the world works. So there's this kind of, classic example of the old riddle where you ask, how can a man who has to take, a wolf and a rabbit and a cabbage across the river in a boat and get them all safely to the other side? And of course, because wolves will eat rabbits and rabbits will eat cabbages, there's lots of scenarios that don't work, that won't get everyone over. And so you have to solve this complicated logic problem involving many trips and leaving things on the shore and coming back. Well, researchers kind of asked the latest models in April how to solve a simpler version of that problem, which is just how does a man get a wolf across the river in a boat? Well, the answer is very simple. Put the wolf in the boat and take it over, right? Or the fox or whatever it is. But the models kept giving these incredibly nonsensical answers that made no sense whatsoever, because they were trying to replicate the more complicated pattern instead of the simple answer, which shows that they didn't understand the problem. And in fact, many of the answers that Gemini was giving, that Microsoft Copilot was giving, would have required the man to teleport across the river, right? Or walk across the river or something. At one point, one of the things is the boat is on one side of the river, and then somehow a moment later it's on the other side of the river. It just can't track objects in space. So it was very clear that actually this model has no understanding of the world that it's describing. And even when it gets the right answer, there's no understanding there of the world. So I think a really interesting thing is, how do you build an AI system that carries with it knowledge of how the world works as a whole? So things like, laws of physics, but also can integrate that with other forms of knowledge, social knowledge, understanding of social context. We have this weird ability to layer all these radically different forms of knowledge together into a coherent experience of a world that allows us to do things like metaphor, where we can take a concept that, say, only applies in the domain of human sociality, and then we can use it to describe something in physics, or vice versa, right? These models are not good at understanding that because they don't have this coherent experience of the world. So I know Jan LeCun has talked a lot about how future generations of AI that actually get us to AGI will have to have these kinds of robust world models. I don't know that
and some sort of organizer and supervisor and discriminator. I think he's got that coordination function, and the idea that consciousness is coherence. It's the place of coherence, where coherence happens.
It's coherence that allows for difference. That's the curious thing. It's coherence that continually reforms itself when something enters in that isn't coherent, and that can make sense of that new thing, reform and restabilize a coherent view, and then keep moving forward.
I think we could go on for a couple more hours.
Easy.
Yeah.
That's what the summit's going to be for, right?
Exactly. Well, and yes, we are looking at deeper dives into this topic and to consciousness. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. This has been fantastic. Thank you for your book. It's a wonderful read. And we really appreciate you taking the time to chat today.
Thank you for a really fantastic conversation. It's just been a joy to dive into the topics in the book this way. And I hope that your listeners will be excited to read it. Again, it's written to try to not just be illuminating, but enjoyable, funny at times, infuriating at times. So hopefully people will seek it out.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
It's better than solid state.